Righty ho folks, so our PowerPoint on Lenny. Remember, Lenny hasn't come up in a while, so it could be that our character question will be on Lenny. So let's see what we can relate to him in relation to AO2 language techniques. Okay, so the first time we see Lenny, we've got this description to allow us to visualise his character. So behind him, remember that's the reference to the first man and the idea that it is George who's always leading. So behind him, George, walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large pale eyes and wide sloping shoulders. He walked heavily, dragging his feet a little the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. So if you remember with George, we had those restless eyes, those sharp restless eyes. And here we don't have restless eyes, we have a shapeless face. Oh, I thought that was going to be a highlighter there. We have the shapeless face, large pale eyes, sloping shoulders. He walks heavily. He drags his feet a little the way a bear drags his paws. So this is the first time that we have had description of Lenny, and that description immediately aligns him with animals. And here he's being aligned with a bear. And that is, let's see if I can get a pen here. What one was pen? This one? Okay. So this imagery is ursine, bear-like. Ursine imagery. Ursine means bear-like. So the imagery employed here is ursine. It's relating Lenny to a bear. Now, the idea of comparing Lenny to an animal is something that happens all the way through the novella. And when a human is compared to an animal, that's called zoomorphism. The opposite of anthropomorphism, which is what we have in some of our poems, like in our August Midnight by Hardy. So we have zoomorphism here. Now, why does Steinbeck compare Lenny to a bear? Well, or why does he compare Lenny to any animal? Well, the key thing here is when we think of Lenny as a bear, he's big, he's powerful, just like a bear. But he's a creature of instinct, just like any animal. And in terms of the idea of Lenny being deliberate in his action, that Lenny being manipulative to a point where he knows exactly how to exploit George's emotion for him, that really isn't what an animal would do. And what we're thinking here is that by comparing Lenny to animals, by using constant references to zoomorphism, what Steinbeck wants you to do is not to judge Lenny by normal human standards, but understand that he is a creature of instinct, that he acts to defend himself when instructed. He is not an arch manipulator, he's not exploitative. He is in some ways a character who can be seen as innocent of any of those deliberately hurtful things that people do. So when it comes to the idea of Lenny being a character who should be blamed for his action is not premeditated to hurt. Instead, he acts instinctively, and like an animal, he may cause pain, but that was not his deliberate intent. And so when we're thinking about blame, we always have to temper it. We have to temper that blame. How culpable is he if he is not in control of this huge body of his, if he is not in control of his mind? And that is a mitigating circumstance against the idea of saying that he is fully to blame for everything that happens. What you have here is that Lenny's first introduced, he's described as walking heavily, dragging his feet a little. That's quite an interesting reference, because when George leaves the barn in chapter 5 to go and kill Lenny, George walks dragging his feet. So there's a nice little parallel. The first time you see Lenny, he's dragging his feet, And the last time, well, it's not the last time because you see him in chapter 6, but in chapter 7 or chapter 5, when all hope is gone, when George knows that he has to go and make the ultimate sacrifice, he drags his feet just like Lenny did at the start. Okay, let's move on. So Lenny snorted the water like a horse, and you've got that nice little simile. There's your AO2. So far in relation to AO2s, we've had zoomorphism, we've had the parallel with the bear, that sign imagery. Now we've got a simile here again, another way of linking to this use of zoomorphism by Steinbeck. Now this isn't an sign image, this is an equine, but here, look, don't get strung up on those terms. You know, it's not, this isn't a classifications exam, so don't worry about that, but think about that simile, snorting the water like a horse. And what does it do there again? The reference to the animal world, paralleling Lenny with an animal, creates this idea of his size, his power, but also that he is a creature who responds to his own instincts. And George criticises him, saying that he would drink out of a gutter if he was thirsty. So he acts on instinct. It's not logic, nor is it the will to hurt or the will to have power over others that is the motivating factor for Lenny. It is his instinct. Okay. And then we have the idea of Lenny's loyalty to George. And Lenny says, you drink some, George, you take a good big drink. And it's one of the first simple acts of friendship we see in relation to George and Lenny. And Lenny looks out for George in this very simplistic way. But what we have here is that George is always there looking out for Lenny. George, remember, he was the first man. He has his restless eyes. So he's always looking for real and present danger in association with Lenny. And here we have the idea that Lenny tries to look after George as well. The relationship between these two is symbiotic. They both benefit, albeit that George benefits by having Lenny with him to counteract the loneliness that all ranch house men feel. Lenny benefits by having George there, constantly looking out for him, trying to prevent danger, and then when danger happens, trying to navigate away from it, or try and remove Lenny from the situation that's risky or dangerous. But here we have this lovely simple act of friendship that shows that Lenny tries to look out for George in whatever simplistic way he can. Lenny dabbed his big paw in the water. Look, George, look what I've done. Oh, God bless him. Right, again, second time we've had that reference to Lenny as a bear, that big paw in the water. And what you have here is a nice little contrast. You have the idea of Lenny dabbed his big paw, and paw being a way to associate him with a bear and with power and with strength. So you have that physical power and strength, and then you have the mental weakness. Look, George, look what I did. And again, just like a child, he's looking to his parental figure. He's looking to George, and he's seeking approval. He wants George to be proud of him. So this is a nice little piece of juxtaposition, because the reference to the paw, the metaphor of his hand as a paw, connotes strength and power and physicality, but it's followed by a little piece of dialogue. And what does that dialogue suggest? It suggests the childlike qualities, the naivety of Lenny, the fact that he looks to his parental figure for approval, sees George as a role model, and wants George to be proud of him. In relation to George being a role model for Lenny, you've got this one. Lenny, who'd been watching, imitated George exactly to see whether he had it just right. So that idea that Lenny imitates George exactly, that he looks carefully at what George is doing and wants to be like George. He aspires to be like George. He admires him. He loves him. He treats him as a role model. It's that simple admiration, and again, it suggests the vulnerable childlike quality of Lenny. It's important that he wants to be exactly like George because he never doubts George for an instant. He sees George as an aspirational character and as his friend. Here we have adverbs, and remember Steinbeck relies heavily on adverbs in order to communicate to the reader where their sympathies should lie. So here we have Lenny looking timidly. Where are we going, George? And so far we've had Lenny compared to a bear, and we've had him compared to a horse. Now, neither of those two animals are timid, but here what we have through that adverb is that even though Lenny has this huge physical capacity, there's a timidity, there's a naivety, there's a vulnerable quality to Lenny that is all to do with his mental instability, his mental disability. Now, it doesn't matter what that is. We're not going to label it. We don't know what it is. But we know that because his mind is not as strong as his body, therefore we have to make allowances for him. So in a situation when someone would be normally blamed for a particular situation, we have to try and mitigate against that idea of outright blame in relation to Lenny, because Lenny is not a normal man in that situation. He has a disability, he has an impairment, and that is something that we always have to take on board. He trusts George to lead him the right way. Remember, the first time we hear of George, he is the first man, he is the leader. And it also perhaps suggests that he has this mental disability which requires him to be reminded of even the most basic instructions. So that's even more than childlike, isn't it? Because a child can remember basic instructions. It lets you know that Lenny's mental disability is something that has a huge significance in what will happen. I tried not to forget. Honest to God, I did, George. And he tries to lessen George's anger by making George realise that he's trying hard to remember. He doesn't want to disappoint George, but of course he always does. He does disappoint him, he does frustrate him, but none of these things are deliberate acts. They are as a result of his mental weakness, of his mental disability. And you always have to bear that in mind. You cannot be too strident in relation to Lenny and thinking, oh well, if you think about the body count in relation to Lenny, if you think about the mice and the puppies, and then ultimately Curleys Wife, you would think, oh my gosh, is he psychotic? But of course, that cannot be seen as a situation for this man, because he is not a man who is in control of his physicality or his mental processes. Instead, he is a creature of instinct, and the fact that he's constantly compared to animals is a way of letting you, the reader, know that Steinbeck is doing that deliberately to let you know that you have to judge him in a different way. Okay, I tried. I remember about the rabbits. So Lenny focuses on what's important to him, and in this case it is the rabbits. And the simple pleasures that he looks forward to so much, the idea of being able to tend the rabbits, those simple pleasures, they are sweet, they're simplistic, they're innocent in a way, but what they do let you know as a reader is that they are ultimately selfish. It's the things that matter to Lenny that he remembers. He only thinks about what's going to affect him personally. And that's something that you'll pick up on a little bit later, particularly in relation to the death of Curleys Wife and how he explains that to George. It really is, if it's not personal to him, if it's not immediate and it's not personal, then it's not something that he can remember, or it's not something that he will think of or ponder over. So Lenny's face broke into a delighted smile. Why, sure, George, I remember. And look at that lovely adjective there, that delighted smile. And there's a real sense of pride. Lenny has a sense of pride that he can do something to please George. And And again, you have that idea that he wants to please George. He wants George to be proud of him. He wants to remember because George tells him it's important to remember. And when he does something that he thinks will please George, he has that delighted smile. And again, connotations of childlike innocence there. And then when he gets something wrong or when he doesn't remember, he looked down at the ground in despair. Now just look at that, from delight to despair in one easy moment. And it's all relating to Lenny's ability to be able to please George. And that emotive word choice of despair, that he can't cope with disappointing George. And I think that's a nice wee way. You can maybe even remember those two phrases because of the double D, the delighted smile and the ground in despair. And it just shows you, the emotional extremes of Lenny, that he is ecstatic when he can make George happy, and he's desperate when he makes George sad. So that emotional, moving from an emotional extreme so quickly from here to here, that's not an adult thing to do. That's an immaturity. That's an emotional immaturity and a mental immaturity. And again, allowing the reader to make that decision that Lenny can't be judged by standards that are seen as normal. Now, here's where you have to think about, okay, what about if you had to produce a counter argument to make Lenny seem unsympathetic or to make Lenny seem as if he is to blame for things that happen. And I think it's important that you remember that he is docile. So, he is a little bit slow. Well, he's a lot, he's very slow, but he's not stupid in that he can be sly and he can be manipulative when it affects him, when it's in his interests to do so. So here he's got his wee dead mouse in his pocket that he wants to stroke, like you do. And rather than own up to that, what he does is he lies. Ain't a thing in my pocket, he said cleverly. And look at that adverb. And that cleverly is in relation to what Lenny thinks he's doing. Oh, I'm being clever, look at me. I'm going to fool George. So Lenny knows how to manipulate, and so he does it for his own purposes. And the key thing is here, it's innocent enough. It's the dead mouse that he's lying about, but he'll do that in an extreme version in chapter 5, where he tries to cover the dead body of Curleys wife with hay. So what you need to remember here is that what in this context is easily dismissed will be replicated in a more dramatic and a more unjustifiable way later in chapter 5. Lenny's closed hand slowly obeyed, and this is when Lenny is going to have to admit to having that wee dead mouse. And I think your verb choice there is important, obeyed, because he doesn't want to do it. It's slow, but he still does, and that's because George has the power in the relationship. It reinforces here that verb choice, obeyed, and the adverb slowly reinforces the childishness of Lenny, who allows George to assume control and who, like a reluctant child, finally gives in to their parents' authority. And when he's justifying why he has the dead mouse in his pocket, he says, I could pet it with my thumb while we walked along. God bless, does your heart not weep? My heart breaks for this poor man. He's not even real. But anyway, I could pet it with my thumb while we walked along. And that relates back to this idea of Lenny being a creature of instinct. That he is a creature who needs that sensory experience to touch things. So he has this tactile, this need to touch things and touch something that's soft. And again, it relates to this childlike nature that he seeks comfort and security and reassurance in those soft things. So if you think about yourself, maybe when you were wee, when you were little, maybe you liked cuddly toys or had a specific cuddly toy or a specific blanket. And if you had something like that, the reason why you had it was because it offered you comfort and security and reassurance And that's exactly what Lenny has. He has a need to touch soft things to give him comfort, security, and reassurance. Because remember, the world in which he lives is hostile to men like him, men who are not perhaps economically valued, or men who cannot contribute to society in some economic way. And therefore, because he's different, because he stands out, because he has a disability, he lives in a harsh world. And therefore, why would he not want to touch wee soft things, albeit a dead mouse? Okay, now again we have that idea of how does Lenny cope with disappointment? How does Lenny cope with making George unhappy? And here we have it. Then in embarrassment he hid his face against his knees. And what you've got here with his face against his knees, the implication, remember that's an AO2 just as assuredly as any of the techniques that we've talked about are AO2, that your ability to talk about how Steinbeck presents. So the implication here is that Lenny adopts a position that's almost like this fetal position, like a childlike position, which is something that you will see children do and adults when they need to defend themselves, when they want to try and make themselves small, try to make themselves or try to cut themselves off from a situation which is hurtful, or where they want to just escape into themselves. They bury their faces against their knees. It's that idea that perhaps is exploited a little bit more with crooks. You know, the way we said that crooks has this he has this wall of defence when he says, oh, he doesn't want anybody near him, you've got no right to come in here, this is my place. So he has this defensive carapace. Do you remember that word? Carapace, that we talked about in relation to crooks. Well, that's when you have this hard shell that protects you. Now, I think it would be a bit much to reference a carapace here, but what you do have is that you have Lenny sitting in a position which implies a childishness, that he adopts a fetal-like position to cope with his extreme emotion. Again, he feels emotionally vulnerable, he's embarrassed, he's disappointed, and it reinforces his childishness. Okay, now this is the second time that we've linked Lenny to some sort of manipulation, to that idea of him being a little bit sly, a little bit self-centered. Remember, we had the adverb cleverly when he was lying about the mouse, and now we have the idea of how Lenny can manipulate George. He does this time and time again. Now, he does it here for the first time in chapter 1, and he'll do it for the last time in chapter 6. So it's learnt behaviour. It's that idea of having particular rituals that he goes through. It's that need to have a particular and rigid way to reinforce the fact that he and George are together and will always be together. And it's routine. It's the idea of that Lenny and George have this particular routine that they both go through, and when they go through this particular routine, it reestablishes the connection. It brings everything back, creates a sense of equilibrium. It reestablishes the connection. So it says Lenny avoided the bait. So if you remember the adverb cleverly, that idea of Lenny being a little bit manipulative, here he avoids the bait. He doesn't fall for the trick. He sensed his advantage. I want my wee highlighter back. He sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you just have to say so, and I'll go off in those hills, right up there in those hills, and live by myself, and I won't get no mice stole from me. So what is his advantage there? Well, his advantage is that he knows George wants him. He knows George is his friend. He knows George wants him to stay, and Lenny wants George to say that. Lenny wants George to say that, to re-establish the fact that I love you, you're my friend, please stay with me. So it is this idea that they have an emotional dependency, and when things get out of kilter, when Lenny does a bad thing and George gets angry, in order to in order to temper that anger, in order to placate George. Placate, oh, sorry, that's a big P. In order to placate George, they go through this particular ritual. They go through this particular routine. And George says, I want you to stay with me, Lenny. Jesus Christ, somebody would shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. And again, if we think about foreshadowing, if we think about how something happens in chapter 1 and then we see how it happens in chapter 6 in a more dramatic way, here George says, I want you to stay with me. And in chapter 6, George says exactly the same thing. But I think the important thing is here he says, Jesus Christ, somebody would shoot you for a coyote if you were by yourself. And in chapter 6, just after George says, I want you to stay with me, Lenny, just a few lines of dialogue after, it's George who shoots Lenny. Okay, now I'm not going to go into Lenny in the dream in much detail, in the same way that I didn't go into George in the dream in much detail in their separate character videos. There is a whole video on the dream, so the dream is important. If the character question is on Lenny or the character question is on the dream, if the character question is on Lenny or the character question is on George, then the dream is a central thing that you need to go into. So go watch the video on the dream. But I'm only going to go through this quite briefly because you've got that video in the dream. So Lenny was delighted. That's it. Now tell how it is with us. And George went on, well, it ain't like that. Well, with us it ain't like that. We've got a future. We've got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. We don't have to sit in no bar room blowing in our jack just because we've got no place to go. If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for it. Anybody gives a damn, but not us. And Lenny broke in, but not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me and you got me to look after you, and that's why. And he laughed delightedly. Oh, God bless. So the important thing here is, look at that wee short sentence. There's a nice wee AO2. The short sentence that Lenny broke in. So overjoyed is he with the idea that they've got each other, that he interrupts what George is saying. He breaks in, and lovely wee bit of repetition, because, which again shows his enthusiasm, it shows his delight, it shows him in a very childlike manner. He laughed delightedly. Oh, he laughed delightedly. Again, the adverb delightedly shows the pleasure that Lenny derives from going through this ritual of the dream and reliving it time and time again. And I suppose one of the things you can think about in relation to the dream is, because ultimately when you read the novella you think that the dream is lost, that there was no hope, that George in his defeat in chapter 6, you get the sense that perhaps the dream never could have happened. But each and every time George goes through this ritual where he talks about the dream to Lenny, you could argue that each and every time the dream is real for Lenny then. He gets so excited, he gets so carried away, he laughs delightedly, that when George speaks of the dream like this for Lenny, in this comforting way for Lenny, that it is something that Lenny imaginatively engages with, that it is real for him at that moment in time. And I love the fact that he says, no, I forget things, I forget some of the things. Tell how it's going to be, how it's going to be. And for Lenny, what you have there is that it is going to happen. So for George has the rational, realist mindset. We'd love to do this, but can it ever happen? And for him, it's escapism. The idea that this thing could happen is a piece of escapism. But for Lenny, it's something that's almost tangible, that he in his mind he can be there. His enthusiasm for it, the fact that he knows it by heart, despite that he knows nothing else, shows you the value he places upon it. Okay, so then we get to chapter 2, and we get to the bunkhouse and we get to the boss. So the boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. He ain't much of a talker, is he? No, he ain't, says George, but he's sure a hell of a good worker, strong as a bull. And Lenny smiled to himself. Strong as a bull, he repeated. And again, just the fact that he repeats this lovely simile that is in praise of his physical prowess. The fact that he repeats it makes it clear that mentally he is not strong. So George uses the simile to praise to praise Lenny's physical prowess, but the fact that Lenny repeats it automatically shows his mental weakness. With the arrival of Curleys Wife and George's hostile reaction to her, do you remember that Lenny looks at her, that Lenny's fascinated by her? But with that arrival, Lenny cried out suddenly, I don't like this place, George. This ain't no good place. I want to get out of here. Again, if you look at the dialogue, your AO2, your dialogue associated with Lenny, it's simplistic, it's childlike. I want to get out of here. And again, let's think about Lenny as a creature of instinct. His instinct tells him, this isn't a good place, let's leave. Just in the way that an animal will instinctively be able to smell fear or sense fear, or threat. And that's what Lenny does. He has this instinct that lets him know, this isn't a good place for me. There's some sort of threat. There's something to be scared of here. There's some sense of fear that he picks up on, and he expresses that through this childlike dialogue. Okay, now chapter 3 is a big chapter in relation to Lenny and the dream. So you need to go and watch the dream video for that. But the end of chapter 3 is important for Lenny because that is the fight with Curly. Now remember, Curly picks on Lenny because we know Curly and his proclivity to fight big guys. But he picks on Lenny even though he's annoyed with Carlson, not Lenny. But he picks on Lenny because of his own insecurity and his own weakness. But in the fight we have reference again, multiple references to Lenny's huge paws, but here we have reference again, the zoomorphism of Lenny's huge paws. And the animalistic imagery here is used to describe again Lenny's physical self. It's a visual metaphor, and here it portrays Lenny with power and with that strength, the potential of violence, because again we're seeing that as sort of Ursine linking him to a bear, but the lack of deliberate intent behind his physical strength and his physical actions. You need to always keep that in your mind when you're trying to work out if he's totally to blame for what happens. Now, when Curly is attacking Lenny, you have another animal reference, another piece of zoomorphic imagery, because here, look at this, Lenny bleated with terror. Now that verb choice, bleated, what does it do? Well, it contrasts Lenny with a lamb. And what is a lamb a symbol of? It's a symbol of innocence and vulnerability. So yes, you've got Lenny's huge paws with the power that they possess. But here you have the idea that Lenny bleated with terror. So with all that power, there is also the vulnerability of a man who does not know how to handle this situation. You've got this verb. Not only have you got him with that he bleats with terror, bleated with terror, but you've got this verb choice of whimpering. And it's important to realise that Lenny whimpers before he attacks Curly, and he whimpers after he attacks Curly. So remember, he only attacks Curly because he is instructed to by George. He acts because his master tells him to. Again, another animalistic way of seeing Lenny. But the whimpering is important because what does it do? It suggests powerlessness, it suggests fear, it suggests vulnerability, and all of these things are at the heart of Lenny. So when it comes to that idea of how dangerous is Lenny, how much is Lenny to blame with things, you always have to balance what the consequence of his actions with how he feels about his actions. That he's whimpering here. He whimpers While Curly's attacking him, he whimpers after he's beaten Curly. He bleated with terror as Curly attacked him. So there's no malice here. There's no vindictiveness here. There's no deliberate objective to hurt. These things happen, yes, they're consequences, but they're never in the forefront of Lenny's mind. And there's the instruction that that causes Lenny to act. That's the catalyst that makes Lenny act. Get him, Lenny. And here again you have that idea of Lenny being seen in an animalistic way, because like a master and a trained dog, he's responsive to orders. He is only acting because he's told to act. He's not acting out of his own volition. Okay, so now we go to chapter 4 with Lenny. George has left Lenny. He's gone into town with Slim, and now Lenny is standing at the doorway of Crooks's harness room, looking for a little bit of company, looking for some distraction. And he's met with Crooks, who says, I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room. So what Crooks does immediately is he personalises his attack on Lenny. He parallels his situation, the fact that he's not wanted, with this new situation that he's creating for Lenny. So I'm not wanted, so you're not wanted. Again, that's it's a selfish, it's a vindictive thing, but it's totally understandable. Per Crooks has been embittered by his situation. So what Crooks tries to do is he tries to put Lenny in a similar position. But Lenny doesn't have the mental acumen to understand that, and he doesn't really understand the mentality of Crooks, nor what Crooks is trying to say to him here. Crooks scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. Come on in and sit a while, Crooks says. As long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit a while, and his tone was a little more friendly. Now, there's lots to say about Crooks, but this isn't about Crooks, this is about Lenny. So the important thing here is Lenny's disarming smile. So it's important to realise that there's an innocent kindness to Lenny, that he has this disarming smile. A disarming smile that can melt the heart of even somebody like Crooks. Crooks is embittered. Crooks has this protective, that protective shield of the Negro, that carapace, that cynical, that selfish, that unpleasant carapace that he hides under in order to protect himself. And yet Lenny's smile, disarmingly, Lenny smiles at him, and that defeats Crooks. So it lets you know that the innocence, the kindness, the childlike quality of Lenny is something that can even let Crooks imagine for the very short time together that he is with someone who could be possibly a friend. But Crooks exploits that. Remember, the idea of being able to exploit a white man is something that Crooks really relishes. And what he does here is he attacks Lenny at the point where it would hurt the most, which is Lenny's relationship his relationship with George. And he says, George can tell you screwy things, but it don't matter. It's just talking. It's just being with another guy. That's all. And it's important to remember that Crooks really does envy the relationship that Lenny has. He envies it because he believes that Lenny's not worthy of having it. George can tell you screwy things and it don't matter. So Crooks understands, like Slim, that the important thing in life is to connect with another human being, and Lenny's relationship with George allows Lenny to have that connection. Okay, this is when we start to see some of the bitterness that is associated with Crooks. Crooks bored into him, that verb choice. Bored in on him. Want me to tell you what'll happen? They'll take you to a booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. Again, he attacks Lenny and Lenny's relationship with George because he senses Lenny's weakness, and that's a cowardly thing to do. But Crooks has been made bitter and cynical by the life that he has had to lead, and so this cowardly action is something that we can understand, not justify, but understand. And remember, that's an important thing for Steinbeck, because Steinbeck believes that if you can understand a person, it's more likely to lead to love than to hate. So we can understand why Crooks would bore in on Lenny, but that doesn't mean we excuse that behaviour. So the important thing is here that he's making his torture felt, and he's making that torture felt quite deeply here. He hits his mark with Lenny. He wants to lessen Lenny's stature through this simile. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. But in doing it, Crooks is actually lessening his own humanity. The fact that he's taken pleasure in hurting someone as vulnerable as Lenny. But what's important here in relation to Lenny is that what Crooks does is he suggests what the consequence will be for Lenny if he's not with George, that they'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. So he compares Lenny to an animal again, but this time an animal that's threatened, this time an animal that's punished. And remember, in chapter 5, Slim does exactly the same thing. When Slim tells George, that he's got to go and do what he has to do. He knows what he has to do now. He says to George, they'll tie him up, they'll put him in a cage, and that ain't no good. So he understands that the idea that Lenny will ultimately be made to suffer like an animal, he understands that in chapter 5, Slim, and also Crooks, perhaps. Whether he understands it, but he definitely alludes to it here in chapter 4. Lenny is a protector. Lenny growled back on his seat. "Ain't nobody going to talk no hurt to George," he grumbled. So if you think about the idea of, in chapter 3 we had Lenny who bleated in terror and who was whimpering, and now he's not bleating, he didn't bleat, but he growled. So it doesn't have the innocence of that comparison to a lamb. It is more associated with a bear or with a dog. But the key thing is that his aggression that's being articulated here as a growl is because he's trying to protect George. He doesn't want anybody to talk no hurt to George. So if Lenny is violent in a way that is not instructed by George, now here he's not violent, he just is aggressive in his stance, but if he is aggressive, this is the first time that he's really been aggressive with another person, and it's because he wants to protect his friend, protect his master. So just like a dog will bark if somebody tries to intrude upon the master's home, here Lenny growls as he tries to safeguard George. Okay, now the rest of chapter 4 is really focused on Crooks, Candy and Curleys Wife, and less so on Lenny. So the next time that you see Lenny is the barn, and remember you have that lovely warm imagery of the barn and the sunlight, and then into that barn emerges Lenny with the puppy. And Lenny said softly to the puppy, why do you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard." It's like it's the puppy's fault. And he bent the pup's head up and looked in its face, and he said to it, "Now maybe George ain't going to let me tend no rabbits if he finds out you got killed." You have here twice, you got to get killed, you got killed. Lenny doesn't understand really this notion of culpability, that you might have made this happen, that you are responsible, that you are to blame. Here he repeats the phrase "you got" as if it were in some way the action of the puppy that has led to its death. So the important thing with this, with the repetition, your AO2, Steinbeck is suggesting that Lenny doesn't understand. He doesn't understand how he is instrumental in these things happening. He just does not have that understanding, that self-awareness or that logic. He says, "This ain't no bad thing, like I've got to go hide in the brush. Oh no, this ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead." Now again, we've had that idea that Lenny can lie. He can manipulate a situation when he thinks that it's in his interest to do so. And here, I'll tell George I found it dead. Let you know that he's willing to do that. He's willing to lie or manipulate George for his own selfish reasons, because he doesn't want to disappoint George. He doesn't want to have to go hide in the bush. And then suddenly his anger rose. God damn you, he cried. Why do you got to get killed? That's the third time in this. So 3 times you got killed. You got to get killed. The focus is on the victim here, not what he did. You ain't so little as mice. And he picked up the puppy and hurled it from him. Now, what we have here is an increasing stress being placed on Lenny's anger. Now, you haven't really seen Lenny's anger manifest itself clearly, but here you do. His anger rose. You God damn you. So just even the violence of his language there, and then that verb hurled it from him. Again, power and anger associated with Lenny in relation to the death of the puppy, and that power and anger is paving the way for what's going to happen next with Curly's wife. He turned his back on the little puppy. He sat bent over his knees. Again, that's the idea of him adopting this childlike fetal position, and he whispered, "Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me." And he rocked himself back and forth in his sorrow. Now that idea of rocking in his sorrow, again, very childlike. But what we have to think here is that not only do we have the childlike vulnerability of poor Lenny, who's bent over his knees again, who's thinking about his rabbits again, but contrast that there with an increase in the violence of his language. "Damn you," he cried, and the violence of his action, hurled it from him. So what Steinbeck is doing is he's showing you 2 sides to Lenny here. A sympathetic side here where he's vulnerable and childlike, and then a side here that has the potential to be violent and destructive. And it's important that you see these 2 sides, because this side here, that's going to dominate the rest of this chapter. Finally, the last thing I'd like to say, again, we've always thought about how Lenny is selfish in relation to he cares about his own interests. Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. He won't let me. So the first thing that he thinks about is what he won't get, which is those rabbits that he loves. Okay, so Lenny and Curly's wife there. Now it's important to remember that Curly's wife opens up to Lenny. Curly's wife speaks in that, that passion where she just lets everything out because she's scared that she'll be interrupted, because she's never had a chance to speak to anybody before. And the terrible irony of that is that she opens up to a man who's completely incapable of understanding her, because he doesn't have the mental acumen of being able to realise what it is that she's saying. So there is that terrible irony. But Curly's wife laughed at him. "You're nuts," she said. "You're a kind of nice fella, just like a big baby." And he is a kind of nice fella, and he is just like a big baby. But the key thing is, he also has that potential. You know, he hurled the pup away from him. "God damn you," he said. So he has the potential for violence. He has the potential to act out of instinct and not be able to control those actions. So here we get to see that very thing. Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. So again, this idea that he is struggling to manage a situation that is beyond him, struggling to perhaps try and control emotions that are beyond him, and his physicality, which is beyond him. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth. "Please don't," he begged. "Oh, please don't do that. George will be mad." And here you've got quite an ironic situation, because you've got his masculine dominance, his power. He's got his hand over her mouth and throat. That is a position of physical power. But look at the language that he uses. Please don't. Oh, please don't. So you've got this physical position of power, but vocally he sounds desperate. Please don't do that. He's in a situation of weakness. He's asking her not to do something, yet he's the one who's physically in control. And what's his big fear? His fear is that George will be disappointed. George will be mad. She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free. From under Lenny's hand came a muffling scream. Lenny began to cry with fright. "Oh, please don't do none of that," he begged. Now again, twice you've had this verb begged at a point where he's physically in control. So that's the terrible irony of Lenny, that his power is there, but his weakness is always hand in hand with it. Lenny began to cry with fright, and that reminds you during the fight, remember, he bleated with terror and he whimpered. So whenever we have these moments of physical prowess, they are hand in hand with a moment of mental vulnerability, of emotional and intellectual weakness. But unfortunately it all goes wrong. We know what happens, and he breaks her neck. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered. Again, if you think about with the puppy, 3 times he says, "You got to get killed," or "You got killed," or "You got to get killed." So it's not as if he can't even work out how it happened. And here, similarly, he seems bewildered. He just doesn't quite work out how this happened. And then he whispered in fright. And look, twice that idea of being frightened is associated with Lenny. I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing. And he pawed up the hay until it partially covered her. And remember what we said about that idea of trying to hide, trying to manipulate, trying to hide what he's done. Here we have the idea that he tries to cover her in hay. Okay, God bless him. Right, chapter 6 can be a toughie, because then we have Lenny's hallucinations, and they're really quite vivid and crazy. But they have to be vivid and crazy because Steinbeck needs to let you know, because Lenny's just killed a woman, and that's not a good thing. And what Steinbeck is trying to do is he places beside that horrendous act, even though it's tempered with the idea of Lenny's vulnerability and that he's frightened, that he's the one who's begging, even though those things are done, he still killed Curleys wife, and the consequences of that for so many people are tragic, for George and for Candy. And well, Curly doesn't give 2 hoots, but Curly's still mad about his hand, not about his wife, as Slim says. But the key thing is here, what Steinbeck wants you to do is he wants you to understand Lenny. He wants you to understand that this is a man who is mentally ill. This is a man who is intellectually disabled, and therefore we have these hallucinations just to reinforce that. So the idea of his Aunt Clara coming and shouting at him, and then the idea of that huge big rabbit, why are they there? Because Steinbeck wants you to understand that Lenny doesn't have the capacity to reflect on his actions, and so what he does is that inability to reflect on his actions, well, really that is projected into these projected into these hallucinations which come from his imagination. And the point here is that it makes clear the extent of his mental instability, because Steinbeck needs you to understand that he is mentally ill, that he is mentally unstable in that respect, that and if you understand that, then you can understand what has happened and why it has happened, and not perhaps judge him as harshly for it. But just as we saw with the puppy, even though there is a vulnerability and a childlike aspect to Lenny, there is also that aggression and that violence, those instincts that are within him. And here they come out in his vocabulary and his dialogue more than they've ever done before. and it illustrates then that potential for aggression that he has. And Clara was gone, that hallucination, and out from Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat in its haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears and crinkled its nose, and it spoke in Lenny's voice too. 10 rabbits, it said scornfully, "You crazy bastard, you ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You forget them and let them go hungry. That's what you do." And what would George think? I would not forget," Lenny said loudly. "The hell you wouldn't," said the rabbit. "You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell." So, like, if you're just looking at that, the language of the derogatory, the violent language, the abusive language there, that Lenny is pouring upon himself, that in somewhere, even though he hasn't got the ability to self-reflect, even he hasn't got the ability to be self-aware, somewhere within that mind he feels guilty for what he has done, and this abusive language is something that he feels that somewhere in his psyche he feels he deserves. And so when he has this hallucination, it lets you know the impact of the events upon Lenny and how mentally unstable he is. And it gives us that deeper understanding of the situation that Lenny's in, the psychological situation that Lenny's in, as well as the physical situation. And it is the arrival of George that wakes Lenny out of those hallucinations, and Lenny says, "George?" And George says, "Yeah." And immediately Lenny says, "I done another bad thing." So immediately he says, "I've done this." Now, how much of that he can actually take on board, how much sorrow he feels in relation to that, you can't really judge, because Lenny doesn't have that self-awareness or that ability to self-reflect in the way that other men do. But I think it's important that George says, "It don't make no difference," George said, and he fell silent again. And I think that's the key thing. It doesn't make any difference whether Lenny knows that he's done a bad thing or not. These things happen. They will always happen. It's a cycle of behaviour that Lenny is trapped in, and there's only one way to break that cycle, and unfortunately that's going to be with George and the gun. Boom. So here we get to the last few moments of the novella that are so tragic for Lenny. So Lenny's done a bad thing again. Lenny has made George angry again, or so he thinks. But remember, these scenes are all full of dramatic irony, because you as a reader know what's going to happen. George knows what's going to happen. The only person who doesn't know what's going to happen is poor Lenny, who thinks that we can go through our little routine. I can say what I need to say. He'll say what he needs to say. We'll talk about the dream. And then he'll say he wants me to stay with him, and then everything's back to normal. Lenny thinks that again this little cycle can just continue, but we know that's not going to be the case. So even when George doesn't play his part, even when he says, "Go on, George, ain't you going to give me no more hell?" And even when George says no, Lenny then plays his part. So it's not as if he can sense or understand that things are different, and that's important, because we find out how different things are when George recites the dream, because he does so woodenly. But Lenny doesn't even pick up on that. He doesn't have that awareness to pick up on the fact that things are different now and will never be the same. Well, I can go away. I can go right off of the hills, and I can find a cave if you do want me. And George shook himself again. "No," he said. "I want you to stay with me." And when George says it there's a real sense that he means it, that I want you to stay with me, but he can't make that happen. Something else has to happen now instead. And Lenny goes on again, completely unaware of how the tone has changed, how the mood has shifted, and he says craftily, "Tell me like you did before again," that the manipulation of the situation. "I want you to talk about the dream. We use this to re-establish our friendship, to make everything right again." And even though we as a reader know things never will be right again, Lenny doesn't sense that. and it ends the way it always does. And I got you, and we got each other, and that's what gives a hoot in hell about us, Lenny cried in triumph. Now remember, he's cried delightedly at that, but here he cries in triumph because he remembers. And there's a terrible irony here that, you know, this is the moment of Lenny's triumph, and it's just preceding the moment of his ultimate defeat, because it's the defeat of the dream. It's the defeat of everything that they wanted for each other, with the death of Lenny. Another man's voice called up from the river, and another man answered. And again, with George, we talked about the idea about how pressure is closing in, how the pressure is rising, because we know that they're going to be discovered, and therefore the impetus is upon George to act, and for George to act now. But Lenny doesn't get any of that, doesn't sense any of that, and instead he goes on about the dream. Go on, said Lenny, and George raised his gun, and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again. Now here you've got Lenny being associated completely unwittingly with trying to support George at this moment in time. George is trying to do the worst thing that he's ever had to do. This is his opportunity to make this sacrifice, to prove his love, to prove his friendship, but he's finding it so difficult. But if you look at Lenny's dialogue, Lenny says, go on. Now, the dramatic irony here is Lenny means, go on, tell me about the dream. But as a reader, perhaps Lenny's go on, for someone like George, can be seen as his approval, his sanctioning of what has to happen. Go on, do what you have to do. Oh, look, Lenny giggled with happiness, probably the most explicitly childlike reaction, giggled with happiness. And again, what does that do? Put that into the context of what's happening here, and it just heightens the tragedy of this. It makes this situation even more poignant. And live off the fat of the land, yes. And remember, Lenny, I've talked about this in the dream, and I'm not going to go into it because it's in the video about the dream, but the idea that Lenny says this phrase and he doesn't even know what it means, but to him it means the world. It means the idea of everything that they ever wanted. And Lenny turned his head. No, Lenny, look across the river, like you can almost see the place. And it's that idea that Lenny dies with the dream in his mind and the dream in his eyes, because he looks across the river just as George tells him to, and he sees it in his mind's eye, just the way that he does every time that George speaks of the dream. And Lenny obeyed him. Again, the master and the dog imagery is there. George tells him to do something, Lenny obeys him, Lenny does it. And George wants Lenny to die with that happiness in his eyes, with that happiness in his heart. Lenny said, I thought you was mad at me, George. No, said George. No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I've never been mad, and I ain't now, and that's a thing I want you to know. Again, this idea that George makes sure that Lenny dies a good death. He dies knowing that he's never been mad at him. He dies knowing that the dream's across the river, keep your eye on it. And the voices are closing in and the pressure is rising and it has to be done. And George raises the gun and listens to the voices, and Lenny begged, let's do it. Let's get that place now. Now, let's just think about the dramatic agony. Agony? Oh, it is agony. I hate it. Well, I hate it and I love it because it's so brilliantly written, but it's just so tragic what happened to Lenny. But what I mean here is the dramatic irony of this, that Lenny begged, let's do it. So just when George needs that sanctioning, he needs to know that he's doing the right thing, Lenny is begging, let's do it. And you could see that as, as dramatic irony, that even though he doesn't know that he's doing it, albeit unwittingly, that he's sanctioning this last act of love, this last act of friendship.